The balance of agony. By the dawn of 1917, the world was bleeding dry. 3 years of stalemate had turned the European continent into a graveyard of empires. The war to end all wars had become a relentless meat grinder, a mechanical monster that consumed generations of young men and spit out only mud and sorrow. The generals were out of ideas, the politicians were out of money, and the people were out of patience. The scales of history were perfectly, tragically balanced. But within the span of just 8 months, 2 seismic shocks would hit the planet, one from the rising sun of the American West, and one from the crimson fires of the Russian East. These 2 events would not just end the conflict, they would draft the blueprint for the next 100 years of human history. The sleeping giant stirs. Across the Atlantic, the United States was a land of humming factories and soaring skyscrapers, watching the carnage from a distance. President Woodrow Wilson had campaigned on the promise of keeping us out of the struggle. But neutrality was becoming a luxury the Americans could no longer afford. Germany, desperate to choke the British Isles, unleashed the invisible wolves of the deep, the U-boats. Their policy of unrestricted subsurface activity meant that any vessel, regardless of its flag or its passengers, was a target. When American hulls began sinking into the dark Atlantic, the mood in Washington shifted from caution to cold fury. Then came the Zimmermann telegram, a secret German invitation to Mexico to strike at the American heartland. It was the final spark. In April 1917, the neutral bank of the world became its great arsenal. The economic tidal wave. The moment the American Declaration was signed, the financial center of gravity shifted. Britain and France were on the verge of total bankruptcy. America didn't just bring soldiers, it brought a bottomless checkbook. The golden lifeline, billions of dollars in credits flowed into London and Paris, ensuring that the supply chains for food, fuel, and ammunition remained unbroken. The industrial miracle, cities like Detroit and Pittsburgh transformed overnight. Ships that used to take a year to build were now hitting the water in mere weeks. The sheer volume of American steel and coal meant that for every shell Germany fired, the Allies could return 10. The Doughboys and the psychology of hope. By early 1918, the Doughboys, fresh, idealistic American troops, began arriving at a rate of 10,000 men per day. They weren't battle-hardened, and many were tragically naive about the horrors of the trenches. But they possessed something the Europeans had lost years ago: optimism. To a tired German soldier who had lived on sawdust bread and hope for 3 years, the sight of 1 million well-fed, energetic Americans was a psychological death blow. It wasn't just that the Americans were there, it was the realization that there were millions more behind them. The Eastern Eclipse, November 1917. The collapse of the Romanovs. While the West was gearing up, the East was tearing itself apart. The Russian Empire was a hollow shell. Millions of peasants had been sent to the front without boots, sometimes without even rifles, told to wait for a comrade to fall so they could take his weapon. The bread lines in Petrograd grew longer as the winter grew colder. In March, the Tsar fell. But the new government made a fatal error: they stayed in the fight. They didn't realize that the Russian people were no longer fighting for the Tsar or for territory, they were fighting for survival. The arrival of the storm, the Red October. In the shadows, Vladimir Lenin and his faction were preparing. With the famous cry of "Peace, Land, and Bread," they struck in November, October in the old calendar. This wasn't just a change in leadership, it was the birth of a new world order. The decree on peace, Lenin knew that to save his new state, he had to stop the bleeding. He didn't care about the imperialist goals of the Allies. The bitter price, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, was signed in March 1918. It was a surgical amputation. Russia gave up vast territories, Ukraine, the Baltics, Poland. The Eastern Front, which had tied down millions of German soldiers, simply vanished. The Great Migration of Steel. For the German High Command, this was the miracle they prayed for. With Russia out of the picture, nearly 1 million veteran German troops were loaded onto trains and sent racing toward the west. It was a race against time. The German spring offensive of 1918 was a desperate gamble. Can we break the British and French before the American flood becomes an ocean? The collision of two futures. The final countdown. The year 1917 created a fascinating paradox. In the East, the old world died and a radical new ideology was born. In the West, the new world arrived to save the old one. If the Russian front hadn't collapsed, Germany likely would have surrendered by early 1918. If the Americans hadn't joined, the French army, already mutinying and exhausted, might have broken under the weight of the German troops arriving from the east. The legacy, a bipolar world. As the smoke cleared, the map of the world was unrecognizable. The United States emerged as the world's creditor and its primary moral and military arbiter. The Soviet Union, the successor to the Russian Empire, emerged as the world's first ideological challenger to the Western system. The rivalry that would define the 20th century, the Cold War, wasn't born in 1945. It was born in the mud and the chaos of 1917, the echoes of 1917. History isn't just a list of dates, it's a story of momentum. 1917 was the year the momentum shifted forever. We see its echoes today in the geopolitical tensions of Eastern Europe and the global influence of the American economy. When you look back at that pivotal year, you see a world at a crossroads. One path led to the rise of the superpower, the other led to the birth of the revolution. Both paths would eventually meet in a struggle for the soul of the modern age. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the turning point of the Great War. If you found this journey through time compelling, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more historical insights. Until next time, remember, the past is never truly dead, it's not even past.